Okay, super. Welcome.
Oh, well, excitement is never far away. Yeah, and thank you. Thank you for the invitation and for your kind introduction, and Brett for organizing the occasion as well. As I think I mentioned to you, I've had many happy times in Santa Barbara, in Las Canoas Road particularly, and would very much like after this event to go down to the Cafe Angolita Beach and
Good one.
Have something liquid.
Very good. Very good.
Anyway, let me just give some context to what I'm about to say, both in a general sense and in a specific sense. The context for this talk lies particularly in a special forum for the journal Globalizations, which is on the theme of, is an integrated theory of globalization possible and is it desirable? Which is really a handle around which to offer a set of responses to the book recently published by Manfred Steger and Paul James called Globalization Matters, which I'm sure you are all familiar with. Mm-hmm. And which dwells on the theme I want to pursue here, which is the remit of global studies. The talk is located too, as you kindly pointed out in your circular, in my recent, can I say corpus? It sounds very grandiloquent to say that. Stuff I've written recently, mm-hmm. From 2013 onwards, and culminating in a short piece I did, I think, at your intervention for Global E, on where globalities are found. So this talk builds on those sort of precursors, but it's particularly focused on what Steger and James say in their recent volume, Globalization Matters. So that my thinking about these things has developed over the period since about 1995, really, I suppose, but particularly in 2013. And I still hold to the same tenets that I think that I elucidated then, or at least set out then. Whether they were lucid or not, I'm not sure. Which I think provide a prospectus for a rich and intellectually challenging global studies. Of course, there's another context to which you've all been referring while I've been absent without leave, and that's the events, the local global events of the last 2 days taking place phenomenally in the United States. And the question I suppose we have to pose is how will they play out in the career of different globalizations and in the prospectus for global studies. I was reading a piece in the British newspaper, The Observer, last Sunday by a very good journalist called Nick Cohen, who pondered on Sunday, I quote the title, "We're endlessly told why populism works, now we might see how it fails." Well, don't hold your breath, I suppose, is the proper response to that in the light of what is presently unfolding. And then there's, of course, there's an even further context in the, and pressing, you may say more pressing context, in the indifferent globality of the pandemic, which among other things gives a new gloss to the concept of agency that is at once individuated, connected, and global. So I will now start what is, I suppose, the talk proper with a qualifier, a government health warning at the outset, and I should apologize to the very famous English satirist whose title I have plagiarized. I'm not offering, as Jonathan Swift did, a modest proposal, but an immodest proposal for the conduct of global studies. Although on reflection, I think probably it's more modest than immodest. So let me come to the matter in hand. Globalization Matters, which as Manfred and Paul say, is a prospectus for hard times, in effect, or dislocated times, at any rate, is an important, and I think in their sense, and I think in my sense also, an engaged analysis of the changing qualities of 21st century globalizations. And the book, of course, is given particular currency in the obvious dislocation in many facets of the global political and cultural economies of late. And I suppose it goes pretty much without saying, but I'm going to say it, that global scholarship should attend to the causes, the symptoms, and effects of dislocation, whether these are found in the impact of social media and artificial intelligence on human consciousness, and on what we mean by intimacy, the awesome implications of the Anthropocene, the surge of neo-authoritarian politics, and indeed the global spread of the coronavirus. In respect of all these things, it must examine trajectories of change and weigh the harm or good that they might do. Global studies in that sense must never shirk the task of revealing hegemonic orders or bespoke globalizations of bias, charting their careers and their effects. In this respect then, in all those respects, I suppose, research and pedagogy on the global has to be engaged. But as ever, the question, or one of them at any rate, is what does that mean? How engaged, and to what ends? So I'm encouraged, I think, by the intellectual commitment and ambition on offer in Steger and James's pretty elegant and detailed prospectus. And I'm also taken by its moral comportment, if that's not too challenging a thing to say at this stage in my talk. It addresses the changing dynamics of and contradictions in globalization processes, and then adverts the possibilities, the opportunities that are available to global studies. If my gaze is wandering around here, it's because I'm working from two machines and I'm not sure where I'm looking. So I apologize for
Barrie, if I may, a little practical thing, because we have lost a bit of 15 minutes or something, and we also want to engage a conversation with you and so forth. If perhaps you can emphasize highlights, your line of argument, and develop a few points, and leave a bit of time, at least 20 minutes or so, we would, for a wider discussion, that would be friendly.
Okay, so I'm going to skip what was really an extended examination of straight to which are a number, don't take that much exception to Steger and James's prospectus, but I have a number of questions that I want to ask, and I will just spend the rest of the time that I have available here in addressing those. The questions are basically these. The first is, need we be wary of the lure of seeking an integrated theory of globalization with all that this implies? Because integrated is a seductive but vague and loaded term in the lexicon of global, or I suppose any theory really, and it has to be weighed. Second, must caution over whether you can have an integrated theory of the global, extend to being leery or wary at any rate about the prospects for generating systematic knowledge of the global. Thirdly, how engaged in what for many academics is first and foremost a strategic or normative, rather than or as well as an empirical analytical exercise. And finally, can one take the full measure of these times, any times, by focusing solely or even mainly on dislocation? I'm going to take each of those in turn. I did have, but I won't now dwell on an end piece to those reflections, which offers my view on what amounts to a complexity position on global questions. But I want to take these four questions as the subject of my remaining time. So let's first of all look at the first one. Need we be wary of the lure of seeking an integrated theory of globalization? In fact, to be fair to Manfred and Paul, they mentioned the idea of integrated theory only once, and then in relation to David Held and his colleagues' massive tome, Global Transformations, which came out in 1999, as I recall. So you might say that it's not fair to hold them to account for its bravado usage in hands other than theirs. I'm going to show less restraint, I think. For one thing, what integrated means in this context is not entirely clear, although for many scholars it translates as a macro theory or grand narrative of global becoming. In other words, as Steger and James say, it's theory in a generalizing mode. Even where that is the case, as Jan, you've argued yourself, as I recall, the scholarship often bears a strong imprint of disciplinary knowledge traditions. Some disciplines, I think you advertise sociology and political economy. You might, I suppose, add neo-Marxist studies have been beguiled by the macro theories of one sort or another, while others like anthropology and geography are more grounded, flexible and closer to the warp and weft of quotidian everyday globalization. And on the latter, while such a textured approach risks simple empiricism or pache constructivism, naive phenomenology, it avoids the complaints often made about big globalization theory as too abstract, too casual when specifying key concepts, and too prone to assume causal relationships to pass any kind of muster as a rigorous social science. And Steger and James, I think, are rightly critical of the vaunting ambition of macro-theoretical approaches to globalization. And they also reject the temptation to reduce the study of global complexity simply to an inventory of cross-border exchanges, what I've classified elsewhere as mere connection. I know you would be particularly interested in this notion, given what you are just about to publish. So there's this good, cautious social science, I think. But if it doesn't mean a singular grand theory or a crude empiricist phenomenology, what does an integrated theory of globalization look like, not least for Steger and James? Well, they may let us off the hook a bit here, and you may think it's a blessed relief that they do. On page 77 of their book, they endorse the view that, and I'm quoting, globalization may simply be a blanket name given to a matrix of processes that extend social relations and consciousness across world space and world time. In fact, of course, saying simply is a bit self-deprecating. Their definition embraces objective and subjective processes of globalization, and is suitably open, I think, about the tasks that such a remit sets for global scholarship. Instead of getting hung up on whether globalization is the cause of, an intermediary variable in, or the consequence of social change, the authors opt for a sensible accommodation that globalization's past and present must be seen as, quote again, a dynamic of space-time compression that is in need of explanation, and also a phenomenon that provides explanation of our changing world. Of course, that still leaves them a lot to do. In a subsequent question, I'll return to how they interpret the remit to prosecute an engaged theory of same. For now, and with due respect to their detailed perspectives for the study of globalization, it strikes me as less a theory or a theory and more of a nuanced approach or template, rightly wary of claims that have not and perhaps cannot be met when attempting a theory of the global. This too is good social science, I think, at least it's cautious social science. And what I go on to say is meant to underpin and endorse that approach. Now, for some time, I've argued that the study of globalization and of globalisms and globalities should be governed by a number of precepts. I'm indebted in this respect to Jan's own interventions over time, and especially in and around 2013, 2014. These are markers of good scholarship and form the conceptual and methodological context for my modest proposal. Taken together, they underline what is implicit, at least implicit, in the study of globalization and clearly visible in its variable appearance, namely that it carries, or is likely to carry, a transformative frisson of one sort or another. And the precepts are these. I'll just be very brief about this. First, a critical, and in Steger and James' sense, engaged scholarship of globalization prescribes an inclusive knowledge community. Second, the scholarship of globalization works with some potent concepts, space-time distanciation, superterritoriality, interconnectedness or connectivity, global scapes, emergent globality, and so on. But still, for many people, lacks definitional precision. I recall writing a long piece in the journal Globalizations in 2004 in response to Justin Rosenberg's excoriating, though one-eyed, critique of globalization theory. And I'm wary about using him as a stick with which to beat Steger and James, or indeed global theory as such. But his criticisms remain worthy of note. For rigorous global scholarship to subsist, he says, I think, the three conditions have to be met. You may think these are too straight-laced. One is that key concepts have to be defined and operationalized much more tightly, even where they are seen as contested, ineffably contested. Two, any such definitions would have to yield plausible hypotheses about the possible causal significance of the empirical phenomena used to identify global processes and forms. And finally, hypotheses, however loosely couched, of course, have to be set in actual circumstances and provide evidence of causality, or less demanding, I think, a kind of implicatedness when set against rival explanations of the same phenomenon. This would be true even when globalization is tendered by some theorists as an outcome of other social forces rather than as or the cause of social change. Third precept is to insist that any order in the global system must be seen as evidence of its organic unity, must not be seen, I do beg your pardon, as evidence of its organic unity or of a functional fit between parts of a system that always tends to equilibrium. This, of course, has been a besetting weakness for a lot of social science for many decades. And in discussing if there are such things as global systems, that has to be dispensed with, I think, to a considerable extent. Where globalization is concerned and where globalities emerge, what we observe is a negotiated and contingent condition arising from the articulation of mainly local and situated subjects and structures with more encompassing global ones. The point is, however, that the growing density and extensiveness of articulations, maybe of connectedness generally understood, carry the possibility of systemic disorder as much as they conform to the requirements of a functional order. When global processes are in play, and a lot of people would argue that they're always in play, and global outcomes achieved, the complexity of world-making practice is further complicated, but still systemic. My fourth precept: critical studies of globalization and globality formation must attend to reflexivity in the processes observed. I could develop this at some length, but I'm not going to. Fifth precept: globalization research should aspire to a thoroughgoing interdisciplinarity, because social life cannot be partitioned easily or usefully into discrete zones of experience, and nor should its study could similarly expand on that. I mean, I think that globalization as a set of processes and the study of set of processes morphs together the core identities of classical sociology, industrialization, urbanization, even modernization, along with staple signifiers such as community and society. Or rather, it dissolves the boundaries around them and thus challenges their assumed ontological solidity or conceptual and epistemological givenness, as these appear in much classical social theory. You might say, if you were going out on a limb about these sort of things, how can global scholarship continue to endorse those shibboleths or fudge their usage and still hope to comprehend or even allow the new architectures and subjectivities found in global complexity? And finally, my final precept is the importance of a truly multidimensional approach to global knowledge creation and theory construction. Steger and James consign, I think that's the right word, multidimensionality to one of four modes of theorizing global constitution, characteristic of what they call the dominant framework. Multidimensionality is the motif of the domain mode of theorizing. For Steger and James, it signifies a shift away from all-encompassing theory to a more modest attempt to chart the contribution made to global constitution by various domains, primarily economic, political, cultural, and ideological. Multidimensionality then, for them, for the domain mode of theorizing, disaggregates the enormous task of understanding global constitution and allows disciplinary specialists to practice their wares in pursuit of that larger goal. Now, I've got no problems with a lot of this. nor were they concerned that reassembling the big picture from the sum of its domain parts is a very difficult task. But it still seems to me that it's a rather grudging attribution that understates the importance of multidimensionality to global scholarship. Of course, they are right to be cautious. These days, who thinks that pairing off economics from culture and both from politics results in good social science? Practically nobody. But does that wisdom always translate into research design and implementation? All too frequently, multidimensionality means little more than a pious nod to what are taken as the cultural aspects of social formation, and then as only a kind of, what would you call it, equation filler when material considerations fail to pass muster. Meanwhile, in journalistic and policy-driven accounts, there remains a strong economistic bias, though this is rarely bolstered by theory on what causes globalization and how it comports. My point, I suppose, which is also a bit pious now I think about it, is that it ought not to be like that. A truly multidimensional approach to globalization doesn't start from the a priori assumption that one sphere of existence, one domain, if you like, is anterior to or imminently more potent for explanatory purposes than another. That precept should be a guiding principle of research design and research training. Studies of globalization and globalization theory, global theory, aspire to multidimensionality in broadly this sense, but implicit assumptions and theoretical partiality often militate against it. So that's my reflections on their notion of, is an integrated theory possible? What about the notion that it's difficult to comprehend global knowledge and therefore offer systematic knowledge of the global? The idea of integrated theory, certainly macro theory, is hedged about with suitable cautions. But does that mean then that all attempts at theorizing the global have to be piecemeal and there can be no rigorous and systematic knowledge of the global? On both accounts, I think the answer is no, while recognizing, as Jan did in the journal Globalization 7 years ago, 2013, that there are different kinds of knowledge. And from the standpoint of scholarship, these are deployed with different ends in mind. I'm not going to expand on those, although I do in the full paper. The point is, I think, and especially taking Jan's third level of global knowledge, which stands as a kind of clarion call for global scholarship that is multidimensional and interdisciplinary. It echoes, I suppose, my call to transcend the national frame of reference, and it holds that global studies should be multicentric, partly through embracing the critique of Eurocentrism and Orientalism. It must also show proper address to concepts such as globalization, for too long neglected or underplayed in models of globalization as a simple dialectic of domination and resistance. Overall, this scholarship is truly kaleidoscopic in its coverage, or if you prefer, multi-perspectival, addressing global issues from the standpoint of North and South, East and West, national and local, collective and personal. Posed thus, a rule of thumb for the remit of global theory or global scholarship is that nothing is ruled out, provided the subject or theme carries global content, which means that it addresses the global through the lens of individual and collective experiences and how, if ever, these mesh, explores relationships between, or even better, explores relationalities between local or mobile subjects and more encompassing structures of materiality and meaning, and keeps an eye on history. Now, I had a little digression here, almost a little digression, on what Arjun Appaduria has recently said in Global Perspectives on history, but I'm not going to say anything about that now, as it would take too long and skew what I'm talking about. Let me come to my third question. How engaged is engaged global theory? Of course, this is a bit like asking how long is a piece of string, but the question is not frivolous when set in the context of Steger and James's prospectus. The authors consciously use the descriptor engaged to signal our intent to link explanatory and normative concerns. That's a quote, by the way. They want to nurture, in other words, a sense of critical reflexivity, much in line with my precepts for all good social science of the global. In fact, they advance a highly nuanced and comprehensive agenda for engagement and a set of specific propositions, which are elaborated in some detail, to deliver it. In many ways, this is unexceptional, and I think I found it so. But it's not, as I think what I've said so far indicates, and what we all know, is not a soft option for the intending researcher. First and foremost, it is a complex and rigorous research design, but only in the last of their propositions, which comes to my point about engaged theory. Only in the last of their propositions do we encounter what might be considered the nub of that point, how engaged is engaged theory. Proposition 5, their proposition 5, states that, quote, globalization theory must be critical. We understand critical as 1, questioning the logic and evidence base of arguments, and 2, engaging concrete global problems and seeking to improve the everyday lives of people around the world, end quote. As we know, globalization, as either the promise or spectre, carries a powerful normative or ideological charge, and the conflation of normative and ideological positions with those professing empirical analytical intent has been something of a feature of research in the field. This doesn't mean that there can be any disjunction between the two, and this separation looks particularly difficult in Steger and James's argument. Their insistence on the need for researchers to be aware of the reflexive nature of the enterprise may be a necessary safeguard against conflation or descent into a complete lack of self-awareness, which is always the problem about the conflation of normative and empirical analytical intent. All that said, their engaged scholarship is a laudable goal, even when couched as part of the strategic mission that is seen to in other areas of research on global constitution, Wallersteinian world systems analysis, Latour's prescription for terrestrial politics, Michael Burraway's defense of critical public sociology, you might lump together in that respect, to effect a wider scholarship of engagement around key themes and issues. We must never forget that globalization takes place in the phenomenal world, and its trammels and opportunities shape consciousness, while affect as well as cognition infuses consciousness and action. Researchers are always right to position themselves, but more to the point, should consistently monitor that position. My last question of Steger and James's prospectus is, in effect, are we concentrating too much upon dislocation? They talk about the great unsettling. What about the everyday facets of globalization? Does that tell us different things? Isn't globalization globalization? Despite the fact that one might observe variation historically and spatially. So everyday facets of globalization. The study of globalization, I know, cannot be delivered solely through address to big issues and transformational or even transitional moments, though it is most assuredly about them. Steger and James know this too, and their whole approach is redolent with the message. Most notably in Proposition 2, where they make a play to study both objective and subjective processes. They counter the notion of globalization simply as the bloodless flow of people, capital, and things, increasingly heedless of borders, or the dramatic sense of traditions and localities under threat from such connections. So I want to say, and I suppose we all know this, implicitly, if not always explicitly, the subjective offers a rich range of experience waiting to be tapped. And as an example, in Allison's, I don't know whether you know this book, I'm not sure how widespread it got canvassed. In Alison Hume's engrossing book On the Commodity Trail, we are treated to a story of everyday globalization and an ethnographical account of those who enacted. The career of bargain store products provides insight into the complex processes that not only connect places and things, sellers and buyers, but highlights the way in which people, peddlers who reclaim and sell waste, plastic from refuse tips in Shanghai, forklift drivers and crane operators in container ports, and shoppers in bargain stores in Solihull and Stockholm, are not only connected through the part they play in the life cycle of a product, but also create a global ecology of production, distribution, and consumption. For most of these people, globalization takes place without reflection, almost behind their backs. But they're no less implicated because of that, and their actions, whether it's producers or shoppers, often reveal a jobbing agency as they go about their daily tasks. And none of this is any the less globalization. Also, of course, revealed, and we never forget this, and it's part of the bigger picture, are disparities in material well-being and the exploitation of subaltern populations in the reproduction of local and global inequalities. In this, though, in Allison's very interesting treatise, and I would recommend it to you. We have the stuff of personal and global interaction and a rich canvas on which to draw. There are a host of other examples in this vein, ranging from Moira's fascinating account of the agency of microbes to the world-making practices found in the use of digital technologies by widely dispersed populations for work, leisure, entertainment, and personal healthcare. We can also see the microhistory, or note, I suppose, the microhistories found in the work of the Annales School and of historians such as Carlo Ginzburg, which places the research emphasis on small social and cultural units and how people construct and conduct their lives within them. This is research, as I think Ginzburg said, that seeks answers to large questions in small places. Let me draw things to a close. A very modest proposal on reflection. All these questions arise from a concern with the remit of global studies and its competence as a knowledge generator. I favor a cast of mind as much as a developed analytical position or methodology. I start from what I take to be the broad goals of global studies, to comprehend the global and how it is made wherever, whenever, and however it manifests. And this embraces, I think it embraces, the intent found in Steger and James's Globalization Matters. Global scholarship has some primary aims: specifying what it takes for something to be designated global, studying emergent and fragile, as well as embedded globalities, paying attention to objective and subjective aspects of the process, giving due reference to processes of localization, and then judging whether and how these insights bear on the sum of knowledge about the social. Key to such address is what we understand as global, and in that regard, some permissiveness has to rule, I think. While the character and perception of global as denoting worldwide consciousness and practice is a given, particular conceptions and spatial configurations, as well as the forces driving them, can and do change. What constitutes the global may or may not equate to planetary scope, although there's the interesting question of extraterrestrial remit in this discussion. But that is of less definitional importance, I believe, than whether the world-making practices carry global content or address. And these two, of course, perhaps inevitably are elusive concepts. Take the area of digital platforms as the capillaries of what I called in my book, Mere Connection, world-making practice, and what Steger and James classify as disembodied globalization. Here, the requirement is that they provide both shared meanings and promote interdiscursiveness. Carrying global content refers to the ways in which digital technologies enable us to surmise and relocate in the imagination, if not otherwise, distant contexts and relate to people, things, and events that are remote from and even alien to our everyday lives. Digital and all other globalities are made at the confluence of connection, consciousness, and institutionalization. And these are performed through a plethora of networkscapes, and in the case of digital technologies, scopic media. Such an approach is commodious and allows that globalization is not just about transitional phases or transformative, but is apparent too in the interstices of relations where situated individuals parlay global constraints. It is both humdrum and climacteric. I'll stop at that point. Sorry to have stretched your patience.
Barry, thanks very much. Sorry for the practicalities and the time pressure. It's marvelous to listen to you, Barry, because I feel the resonance of much of your work, earlier work on global system, and a great rootedness in sociologies of globalization. So please, Barry, thank you very much. What a wonderful conversation. Please, may I invite you all to raise issues or comments or questions. Please, Peter. Your sound.
I want to express my thanks to our speaker for really a macro theoretical approach to to what we have all been studying in some respect or another. I mean, my experience has been at the teaching level and trying to convey ideas about globalization to undergraduate students, because I really feel they need to understand something about the world in which they live. And perhaps there is some normative value resulting from that. We're currently experiencing what seems to me to be an increase in global tribalism. And I wonder if you could comment on whether you feel that globalization as a process that, at least when I started looking at it, was hatched as a process by which we could come together and learn more about each other, and as a consequence, maybe actually get along better. And but what I've experienced has been we get to learn about each other and decide that we really don't like each other very much, and this becomes a contributor to this tribalism that is being exemplified to some extent by America's current election process and Donald J. Trump.
Thank you, Peter. That's extremely interesting. I think my point about being wary about conflating normative and empirical analytical approaches was not meant to suggest at all that there was a need to sort of exclude normative considerations from any sort of discussion that we have. It would be impossible to do that, but merely considerably, that researchers need to be aware of their own position. They need to be reflexive about their own involvement in the process. Okay, yes, yes. There was and continues to be a strong strain of thinking that counsels the prospects for a better world and a better collaborative environment through processes of globalization. I think what we are currently seeing across the world, of which Trump and Trumpism are a particular example, albeit one with significant global clout, is the sense that is implicit in all discussions of globalization, but in those optimistic accounts was often not present, which is that global engagement and consciousness of the global in whatever, an experience of the global in whatever form, may produce a consciousness which is antithetical and oppositional to it, whether this takes the form of, those people experiencing global inequality in one form or another, whether it derives from a sense of being left behind in terms of whatever that means for particular individuals and groups of people. I've just finished, it's just in proof form at the moment, a book on populism and what I've called, only slightly tongue-in-cheek, the new globalization, in which these themes are explored at some sort of length. I mean, I suppose the cynic in me would say that while I don't subscribe to the notion that some commentators, academic and non-academic and activist, have subscribed to that all forms of globalization are inimical in different ways to all segments of the population on a local and a global scale. It has to be recognized that capitalist globalization, globalization that can be relatively easily perceived as destructive of tradition, of identities which may well have been hidden for, or unremarked, is perhaps a better way to put it, for many years, and given them the opportunity and the platform to actually articulate a political force now that, while it isn't unified and uniform on a global basis, is nonetheless a global phenomenon and shows no signs of diminishing. I mean, the article that I mentioned right at the outset by the British journalist Nick Cohen, we endlessly talk about populism works, now let's see how it might fail, can be seen in the light of what is happening, I suppose, as possibly being unbearably naive in its assumption that Trump and Trumpism are passing phases of anti-global consciousness. There is undoubtedly an element that they are anti-global, but whether they're here to stay or not, I think is a matter of, obviously, of empirical investigation. And whether you believe that populism, Trumpism, is, as Ernesto Laclau said, an empty signifier, that it can be mobilized in any circumstances as the opposition in a way that doesn't require detailed and comprehensive intellectual or ideological commitment, or whether you believe it is the wave of the future in terms of unusual forms of politics. I wouldn't like to say at present. I don't know whether that answers what you
I think it brings it down to where we can perhaps appreciate it. It may in fact be more into the psychological realm of resistance to any form of change. And that may explain, at least in part, the populism that we're now experiencing in this country. It seems to me that Trump is focused on a myth of how it used to be. And I think I'm old enough to remember when that myth was explored in reality, and it was a myth. Nothing at least that I can connect with. And it may in fact be a response to feminism to some extent, where the idea of this mythical masculine entity was at the heart of what we wanted to aspire to. And I've noticed it, at least in my own life. Resistance to change has always been one of the difficulties that I've experienced. And that may be true here in a global sense too.
I'm like, do you want me to come back on that, or do you want to invite other people? I could go on at length about this.
Yes, the floor is open, everyone. If I would just add a sentence to your discussion, Peter and Barrie, all of history, powers and power centers have been coming and going, boundaries have been erected and then faded. So to what extent is what is going on now? Global tribalism, a power saying turning its back on the world and withdrawing from the WHO during a global pandemic is actually part of a historical normal. The new element is our expectation and our appeal to collaboration, cooperation, reflects a consciousness, which is part of a gift of this epoch itself. And at the same time, we are both cherishing the gift and are deeply disappointed for its delayed implementation.
Well put.
Well, I think I would agree with a lot of that. I mean, I suppose in terms of the way in which that kind of historical and repeated story of how people think and react to changing circumstances is or seems particularly acute at the moment. I mean, I would say largely because the ease with which it is possible to because of the contagion effect of new technologies, of disembodied globalization, of the sense in which now, unlike I think even in the 1990s, the notion of anti-globalization and what that signifies for a lot of people is readily understood by widespread populations. I mean, I think the mistake to come back to Peter's point, the mistake with the reaction to Trump in 1916, now, not in the last couple of days, the reaction to Trump and to Trumpism often turned on a largely unreflective and considerably demeaning set of judgments about how easily people might be gulled by this sort of rhetoric and his kind of politics, as opposed to locating it in, I mean, I'm not suggesting for a moment one can't still object to the manifestations of anti-globalism in different ways, or anti-feminism, or anti-LGBTQ, and so on and so forth. But to understand the nature of the origins and the opportunities afforded to the articulation of grievance are, if not singularly, then manifestly, a function of the times in terms of people's ability to communicate with each other and other like-minded people, and be gulled or enthused, whichever your interpretation you want to put on it, by clever politicians who are equally technically adroit.
Barrie, from the UK, when you think about Donald Trump and you compare with Boris Johnson also has a grievance politics. The grievance is aimed at the European Union. Do you see a parallel, or do you find it distinctly different?
I think not with Johnson, because I mean, partly because Johnson is a curious figure who has no developed sense of the political, I think, and no strong normative or ideological, well, I'll qualify that in a moment, but no strong normative or ideological positions that would predispose him unequivocally towards one kind of position, pro or anti-European, pro or anti-Trump, and so forth, in a way that one would quite often expect of other politicians. So I don't think Johnson is the right point of comparison. Certainly, in the case of anti-Europe, he tapped into, or at least was willing to go along with, a strain of thinking which was narrow, parochial, Little Englander, not Great British, Little Englander, in its mentality and its remit. But his actual response and his espousal of those kinds of tenets was largely opportunistic. I mean, there was a story going around, you may well have heard it, that on the eve of the 2016 referendum, he had written 2 articles for the Spectator magazine, one of which said, "What a great and glorious victory for the Yes campaign, stay in Europe and prosper, would be," and an equally glowing article suggesting that now Britain had severed its ties with Europe, we could go on to greater things. I think the man has no principle. I mean, he is a libertarian. I mean, people say he's a libertarian, and so his equivocation over the severity of COVID lockdowns and so forth is by charitable account, at any rate, seen as being a function of his libertarian thinking and so forth, as opposed to his natural inclination to equivocate. But so I mean, Trump is perfectly prepared to call him Trump Britain or Little Trump, and there are some similarities. But I think Johnson is even in British terms, where he carries to a different constituency of people, admittedly, than Trump in America, some strains of what a typical British character would actually look like. And that's enabled him to parlay his way around a lot of opposition in the past. But I think probably it won't be sustained for very much longer.
But Brexit will likely happen, right?
Oh, well, well, yeah, I mean, you can argue that, well, it depends what you mean by Brexit, of course. I mean, there's the likelihood, as I mentioned to you when we were talking before we started, the likelihood is partly dependent upon the outcome of the election in the United States. But the likelihood is that on December the 31st, the United Kingdom will have arrived at a deal, mainly a trade deal, a straightforward, limited trade deal with the European Union, which will leave some transitional protocols in place about what's called the level playing field of regulation, which in practice is likely to continue to give the European Court of Justice some kind of say in the arbitration of disputes. There's likely to be a deal done over fishing, which will pander to the great image of the great British fisherman protecting British territorial waters and the national integrity from fish pirates of various persuasions. And the Good Friday Agreement will have been washed down the river. If Trump wins, those things are more likely to come to pass. If Biden wins, you know, he may have more pause for thought. Even the right wing of his party, the European Research Group in Parliament, especially with regard to the fact that Britain is, you know, reneging on key parts of the withdrawal agreement, which relate to the Good Friday peace agreement in Ireland.
May I ask a general question, Barrie, about your theme of integration? You're asking, does our study of globalization imply a perspective on integration, global integration? My hunch is absolutely it does, because globalization means an engagement with the whole. The question that arises is that such an engagement implies the idea of a location, a position from which we look at, we comprehend this integration. Yeah. It implies a center. And we are precisely in an epoch in which centers are crumbling. In a centerless era, we must think of integration, or in an era in which centers are fading. Britain is disengaging from the EU. The United States is saying goodbye to hegemony, and there is no center. The center does not hold. In an era in which there is no center, how do we think about integration? Well, obviously in a multi-centric way, which implies a kind of dialogue that is a bit new to the species. Iran used to, I think it still does, have an annual dialogue of civilizations. It took place in Rhodes. But this kind of dialogue which is not about trade, it is not about geopolitics, it's not about F-35 sales. This kind of dialogue is now necessary, but the premises, the context in which it unfolds is crumbling. This is the dilemma we are facing. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that, and I think it presents particular problems for the construction of I mean, I know this is rather narrow and abstract in terms of phenomenal problems of great depth and complexity, but it makes it more difficult to comprehend the notion of what the global implies and the study of the global implies, if there is no center which cannot hold, and in which there are simply fragments and partialities. So I'm not sure. So in that sense, I think the old notion that globalization as a process was totalizing, that it was possible to construct global theory that was also integrative in that sense, that it covered all possibilities, is blown out of the window. And as a consequence, global studies made both more accessible, since anybody can get in on the act, as it were, but more difficult to comprehend, and therefore, I suppose, more likely still to be the subject of rumor and defilement by those disciplines that think they have a better handle on the nature of the human spirit and the human condition.
Habib, do you want to come in on this? All right. Nelson, Ricardo.
Well, just one comment, very brief. I think towards the end, Barrie suggested that one of the approaches, one of the 5 principles that he was talking about should lead to some kind of global and local understanding. So if Barrie could separate, distinguish between local and global, because if you have a global that embodies, that integrates, that implies some kind of connectivity with local, why do you want an autonomy of the local?
Well, partly I'm drawing attention to that, and I think that Paul and Manfred are also, albeit for different reasons, on the grounds that while there is a kind of default position, I think, in globalization studies and in an understanding of what globalization is, that tends to outcomes that are global in feel and maybe in structure as well, one at least has to entertain the possibility of at least attempted localizations as a response to perceived issues and problems. So that I'm distinguishing, or want to retain, I suppose is a better way to put it. I want to retain localism, localist, as something that obtains. I was going to say on the spectrum between full global integration, localism, but I'm not sure it is a neat spectrum in that sense. It's necessary to entertain the possibility of fervid localism, whether for good or bad purposes, but however you interpret that, as being possible, and for some people, the goal of a concerted and an emergent politics. Some forms of populism fall into this category, so that localism is portrayed either in terms of a search for sunlit uplands, in terms of the ideas that attend the new localism and so forth, or it's presented as a fallback into the dark ages, intellectually and emotionally, and entirely unsuited and unfitted and impossible in the context of even the multicentric and fragmented world that Jan has referred to.
And refers to, Barrie, as a historical normal. Historically, empires, hegemons, they rise, they fall. As they fall, there is a sense of crumbling and disorientation. And in a certain way, tribalisms are ordinary. They're of all times. Now we call them global because some of them are or appear to be louder, but this is ordinary. The new element in the equation is our expectations, our norm, and also necessity of global collaboration, cooperation, because of climate change, because of a pandemic, because of changing natures of capitalism and cooperation. So all of that is, it's all normal. The new element is our standard, our aspiration for global cooperation. And so if we combine these, we have entered a new historical epoch, which is actually a good thing that we engage with a sense of disappointment at the same time. Pardon for this. Ricardo, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting discussion, and I have a question which I completely, and maybe between the speaker Barrie and us shares, is this, on the one hand, you had Trump sort of withdrawing from the WTO and sort of a national impulse. On the other hand, during the pandemic, and I've been reading a report, the Feds have sort of imposed the dollar hegemony. You know, so you have the disjuncture between finance and the Feds and the political, and so I don't know if the notion of the center is not important, because also we have to look at the way in which capitalism is organized. My second question is the role of historical specificity. I mean, you call it the local, and where does it fit into the notion of the global, you know, with its own historical specificity in location and space, and which the question is globalization dependent on a center?
Yeah.
I lost. I'm sorry, Ricardo. I lost some of that because it was breaking up. I don't. To pick up on what I did here. No, I think no. I think it isn't. I think there is a kind of imminent. Can you have an imminent tendency? I'm going to say you can. An imminent tendency to look for a center in the nature of the global, and in the study of the nature of the global. But it would be very hard these days, notwithstanding what I think you said about forms of capital constituting a kind of center, albeit possibly a networked version of that, to designate powerful centrist tendencies in the organization of the global. I mean, this is in a sense where discussions of the local assume a very powerful polemical and ideological edge, where the notion of global as center, local as dispersed, is parlayed into a politics that says, on the one hand, that is what the world is like, and on the other hand, this is the basis upon which a politics of resistance can be organized for different purposes. And I think I said in response to somebody else's question, you know, populism is very easily presented as a politics of the local. You can argue that it's a maverick comportment of the local, but it nonetheless appears as a kind of existential response to what is seen as an overwhelming and centrist tendency in the career of globalization. I'm sorry, I think I missed quite a bit of what you said in terms of your question.
Ashish, please. Yes. Your audio.
I'd actually be curious to hear the first part of Ricardo's question again, and Barry's response to it. And then I have one of my own after.
Please.
Please.
Well, I've read and I might have misinterpreted the distinction between what we define as U.S. geopolitical hegemony, and while Trump is withdrawing from the WTO and saying he's going to do that, the Feds, on the other hand, is sort of struggling for the dollar hegemony. So I'm trying to think, how do we reconcile this notion of hegemony, where you say politically they're withdrawing, but the Feds and finance capital is sort of trying to impose US dollar hegemony. And I'm just wondering how you think about that as well, you know, since it's not an area that I have expertise, but I'm just trying to think about this notion of the dollar hegemony and the contestation for that. So there's not a complete abandoning of hegemony in that sense.
Sure.
I hope it's as clear as mud.
No, it strikes me as a reasonable point to make, but I mean, one can argue that is an apparent contradiction of the contemporary flavor of politics and political economy in the world. You know, the notion of there being a congruence between a hegemonic congruence in terms of the geopolitical ambitions of particular powers, great powers or not, and the imperatives of finance capital, for example, is neat, but increasingly less realized. If you take Trump seriously as an advocate of, you know, rapid and hard-nosed decentralization.
Yeah.
So if I could just quickly respond to Ricardo, so and then I'll ask my question. It's sort of related, goes from it a little bit. So I think Ricardo, what you're putting your finger on is a central tension in political economy. It's what we call the Impossible Trinity. An industrial manufacturing hedge, you need to actually have a different set of economic policies, particularly with respect to exchange rates and a strong dollar, than you would want if you want to reimpose US financial hegemony. And there is a tension between finance and industry here that really sort of strikes at the root of, you know, the coast versus center, Trump versus, you know, the rest of New York, all of that comes into play. So yeah, there are different interests here, and they seek to impose different versions of hegemony for that reason. I know that's tremendously unclear. It's actually, you know, I'd have to.
No, it's a good response.
So Barry, the question I wanted to ask, and this is something, it's sort of a big and naive question, but it's one that I've grappled with for 13 years as an economist trying to do global studies. You know, you lay out your precepts about sort of what now global theory ought to be, and sometimes those precepts, we hear them as this is what global studies ought to be, right? And just like this impossible trinity idea, there's many good things in life you may want to have, but you can't have all of them, right? Sometimes they're in conflict with each other and trade-offs become necessary, right? And which trade-offs you serve, which trade-offs you decide you want to make, which things you decide you're not going to pursue, determine what objectives you're pursuing and whose interests you serve. So for, you know, I could count a few of them. So here we've got multidimensionality. We've got the imperative to operationalize things clearly, and to be reflexive. So here are three wonderful things to have. If we were to operationalize things in a way that is reflexive, we would be thinking about, would my operationalization make sense to these people, these people, these people, these people, right? And if we try to do that for everything, you can't write a paper or even a book or an encyclopedia. It gets so big, right? So what do you do practically? What's the advice here?
What's the advice? Yes, no, the advice is to say you're right. You're absolutely right. I mean, that way lies madness. I mean, I suppose my less embracing point was really to use the notion of reflexivity or reflexiveness in that context, in the context of global studies, to say that the researcher needs to be aware of the normative stroke ideological stroke polemical dimensions of his or her own interventions, and to monitor those, rather than, to take your point, that everything can be handled reflexively in the notion of forever locating oneself in the context of waters that have flowed on. Who said that? Lao Tzu.
Heraclitus. You
Okay.
cannot stand in the same water.
Yeah, the same water. Yeah. So I'm copying out on that answer. I'm doing the and saying yes. That's a very interesting question. I need to give it further thought.
Okay, thank you.
Sort of my sense is in relation to this dilemma. Let's say we have three options. One option is monocentrism. There is one power, Roman Empire, Pax Britannica, Pax Americana, etc. The second option is multicentrism. There is China, there is India, there is Russia, Europe, etc., etc. And then the question arises that you pose, Ashish, reflexivity from every point of view implies, well, there are two options. One is madness, and the other option is omnicentrism. We accept the premise that the local and the global matter everywhere, so that we accept the practical and the epistemological need of an omnicentric approach. All centers, all points are centers or potential centers, and we embrace that complexity, that kind of engagement, while we also practically realize, well, we are not all walking world encyclopedias. We cannot do it all the time, or this is practically very difficult. But this awareness in itself inspires, what to say, Barrie, in your terminology, a modest immodesty. We are compelled to be immodest, and that awareness makes us at the same time very modest. So we arrive at a different sense of balance. Or in your language, trade-offs. We realize we are facing, and the species at large is facing many new trade-offs. And this awareness itself, that is a form of, this is a global awareness. And we should cherish it as a gain in reflexivity, and not just as a handicap or an obstacle. This itself is a new level of awareness.
I wonder if it is. I wonder, because it seems to me that politics enters the gates of this discussion in the sense that we're likely to engage in greater levels of globalization, whether we talk about the economic, social, or more practical day-to-day kinds of things. We're likely to do that if we find that A, we have an interest in this, and B, we're not threatened by input from someplace else. At the moment, it seems to me that our level of tribalism has perceived the rest of the world as a source of threat. And when I say we, I'm really talking about the Trump administration. And this is not entirely new to the American experience. You recall Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1830s made a similar observation about Americans being terribly self-referent. And if something wasn't invented in America, it wasn't any good. And how could it, they stole the idea, that kind of thinking. I've been working in the last number of years, last 3 years, on a project dealing with incarceration reform. And I've learned a great deal from the Scandinavian models about what practically works, as opposed to the system that we have, where we have a 70+% recidivism rate. And then when I discuss this with elected officials, I'm told, don't tell me what the Scandinavians are going to do. I mean, that doesn't matter if it isn't invented here. So along comes Alexis de Tocqueville once again and says, what is real? So I think we're subject to the sense of threat from external ideas, and that's a political decision. You make the politician will gravitate to this issue and advance his or her own career on the basis of what seems politically expedient, whether or not it makes any sense or not. And therein lies the rub.
Peter.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, Barry, please.
No, it's not a problem.
Okay, Nigerians know about Nigeria and they know about the United States. Americans know about the United States, not about the Nigerians also know about Asia and Europe and so forth. The Americans are in a particularly strong bubble. The American bubble is water resistant and soundproof and so on and so forth. So this is a specific exceptionalism, big oceans and a particular historical program, and it is not a global standard. It's an outlier, it's an anomaly, it's a place where people murder Sikhs because they think they are Muslims.
Yeah.
This is unusual by world standards, and we deal with it, but we don't take it as a standard.
I think you may be right.
It's not nice for Sikh people in this country. Huh?
Yeah. Well, I suppose the bottom line to what I'm saying is if we can adhere to an interest-based approach, that is, it is in our interest to learn about this, that, and the other in a non-threatening way. Globalization has the possibility of being extraordinarily helpful. And I think it's almost inevitable. I know that there are some who would argue that globalization is not inevitable. Jerry Cohen, for example, your own department would make that argument. But I think some level, and I guess this has to do with the first principle that Barrie talked about in terms of integration, is we're really talking about the level of integration, what kind of integration we're really talking about. And I think the world is just getting to that point of communication and transportation, a smallness where it's inevitable that we're going to be confronted by each other and ideas that either work or don't work, and we will borrow. And part of that is precisely the globalization that I think is more than a little hopeful.
I mean, do you think that the COVID pandemic alters that sort of prescription?
I think the jury is out. I think large numbers of Americans obviously believe that the pandemic should have had a much more competent response. And they look at other countries, the Korean example, the Taiwanese example, as better than what happened in the United States with over 200,000 dead from the pandemic. Will we learn from this experience? And I'm old enough to have remembered that at the end of the Vietnam War, we said, we're going to learn something from this and never again. I remember a little book by Townsend Hoops talking about that you know, the limits of power. And then we forgot about it. I mean, memory is short. We tend to forget about the terrible costs of failures, and we reinvented. We did it again in Iraq, and I'm trying to explain all of this to my grandchildren, and this is really difficult.
I suppose my point about the COVID thing was one is, I was going to say anecdotally, but I think probably not just anecdotally, that the impact of the crisis upon perception of the world can quite easily work in respect of drawing up drawbridges, of looking for protections, of gainsaying what many people would have taken to be the main dynamics of particularly economic, and probably the more general sense of globalization, which relates to the movement of peoples and ideas and so forth, and whether in fact we are now looking to a future that is more governed by, and maybe possible to be governed by, principles or mechanisms of natural economy.
Yeah.
As well as more unedifying notions about contagion from any number of specified or unspecified others.
Yeah, no, your point is well taken. I still think the jury is out. I just wonder what we or anybody else will learn from this experience. It would be, I mean, I share with you a hope that we will.
See, could we also say integration is happening? Connectivity is all around us, and it has upsides and it has downsides. It also brings us consumer goods and cuisine experience from all, and it brings us also viruses. The issue is not integration. The issue is the negotiation of the terms of integration, which depends on the place and the position from which we approach and understand it, which poses the problem of a center from which we perceive, we experience, we act, and we negotiate. These centers are moving like carpets under our feet. In a historical sense, this is actually normal. It's completely ordinary, and the processes of retreat into a group or expanding a group, it's of all times. The new element is the global scope. And we we both invite it and we grapple with it or reject it at the same time. And dealing with this dilemma, I think, Barrie, it is the heart, it's the theme of your entire approach and your discussion. And this is completely central to our contemporary experience and negotiation. And it's real, and these limitations, they are front and center for all of us.
Yeah, I'd agree with pretty much all of that.
So these are real discussions to have, very 2020, 21st century, and they will be with us for the next thousand years in ever-changing expressions and manifestations.
Well, I hope that we will have another webinar in about 1,000 years so that we can verify your hypothesis.
Our avatars will.
Yeah, and I hope that in the foreseeable future, we have opportunity, all of us, to have a beer at a beachside cafe, either the one by the harbor or the one in Goleta.
Sounds good.
Yes. So hope to see you soon, Barrie, in the neighborhood of Canoas Road. Thanks everybody. Thank you, Barrie, for inspiring a very wide-ranging and multi-layered conversation. It's a great treat to have you in our neighborhood. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you too, and thank you everyone. It's great to meet people in where one knows of, but not having met even virtually before. I'm sorry that the technology went up a kazoo early on, but that's the nature of a partially globalized world.
All right. Barrie, thanks a lot. Everybody, thanks a lot for participating. Marvelous.
Thank you all. Some really interesting points.
Okay, lovely. Hope to see you all soon.
Okay.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
All right.